Artmage was one of the stronger decks in Genesys Format, and they barely touched it on the recent increase and decrease lists. If you're looking to play Artmage in Genesys Format, this is the way to do it. Let's jump into it. Starting with the main deck, I have 3 copies of Medius the Pure. Medius is the main starter of the deck. This is your 1.5 card combo. And with the release of decks like Doom C, it has become abundantly clear that Medius is part of a larger lore, as each of the recent core sets have given us a new archetype to use with him. And that also holds true for Burst Protocol, coming out in early 2026, so stay tuned for that. Then moving on with the profile, I have 2 copies of Artmage Finmill. I'm playing 2 copies of Finmill because Genesys Format is actually quite grindy. There are plenty of games where your turn 1 combo doesn't automatically just win the game. Now, it's not like Genesys Format decks are better than advanced TCG decks. However, if you look at the Genesys Format metagame, you have a lot more decks which are more focused on their engine. You don't have 20 hand trap decks with 20 engine cards, which just perform a turn 1 combo which wins them the game. In Genesys Format, considering staples are point costed and therefore bring your deck total up. So if you want to play a deck with a strong engine, that's probably going to cost you some points. And then you can't just fill your deck with a bunch of non-engine. And without links, a lot of decks are just naturally weaker. They can't go for these access code OTK lines, or IP into SP, which gives you more interruptions without actually having to draw a specific engine card. Now the Artmage deck often locks itself into just fusions, or at least with the field spell just summoning the Artmage cards. As such, you can't just splash a whole bunch of engines together like Fiendsmith piles, and just do everything on turn 1 and then your opponent loses the game. Most decks kinda have to grind a bit back and forth, because they are simply less powerful. But because of that, you also have more engine in your main deck. As such, you can grind for longer because you have more engine cards. A thing that in advanced TCG has always been true. The 60 card decks are always able to outgrind 40 card decks, because you simply have more engine, and therefore you have more longevity. And I think that's something you kinda have to take into consideration when you build your deck. You have to plan for turn 3, 4, and 5. Something that, if you're coming from advanced TCG, might not be the same. Now Artmage is a modern deck, it came out a few months ago, but I don't think you build Artmage in Genesys in the same way you build it in the TCG, for these aforementioned reasons. As such, some ratios may be a bit different than what you'd be used to in the TCG, and that is why I'm playing 2 copies of Finmill. Then I have 2 copies of Greflair. As for Greflair, it's pretty much the same reasoning as the Finmill. In TCG, you'd probably play 3 of this, but that is because of the Artmage cards, working so well with the K9. And Greflair being level 5 means you can reveal it for Yokul, or use it to make Ripper, which was something I considered for Genesys Format as well, but with Droll Lockbird being so prevalent, and this card just shutting out Artmage completely, I chose to spend my points a little bit differently, but we'll talk about that later. Then I have 1 copy of Litera, arguably the worst Artmage card because she does nothing on her own. But she's very important for the grind game. However, she does jump back to her hand when we use her effect in the opponent's turn, and as long as you don't have to fuse her off, she'll remain in your hand, and just be good follow-up for the next turn. Then I have 3 copies of Artmage Power Patron, something that usually is just the 2 of in the TCG. However, this also goes along with the grind game that I talked about before. In my testing, I've noticed that the 3rd copy of Power Patron comes up a lot, as Medius can be revived from the graveyard, and he only summons from the deck. It can be very important to actually have those 3 copies, to always be able to summon it with Medius. Now, you do shuffle back a monster, so if you do draw the Power Patron, you can shuffle it back into the deck to summon Medius, should that be your last copy of the bird. But I usually go for multiple bird activations throughout the game. As such, I always want to have the option of doing Medius into bird, and sometimes drawing 1 bird can actually be pretty good. That's it for the monsters. Then for Artmage spells and traps, I have 3 copies of Acropolis. This is just a non-once per turn searcher, the card is absolutely absurd. And then 3 copies of Varnish Alteration to search it out, and 2 copies of Vandalism to grab our Medius. I'm not playing 3 copies of Assault because there are severe diminishing returns to seeing multiple copies of Medius. But this card is still pretty good to draw, in that whilst this card is on your field, you can send it to the graveyard to protect your field spell from destruction. And the effect to make one of your monsters into an Artmage was very prevalent when I had Cartesia in my deck, but just using this to grab Medius is still pretty good. Then I have 1 copy of Pact Awakening. You search this card in a lot of your 2 card combos, and that's because it beats board breakers like Dark Ruler No More pretty efficiently. Additionally, the graveyard effect is actually pretty good by just bouncing back your monsters to the hand. and getting a second use out of them. Then for the last engine piece, I have 3 copies of Fusion Deployment. Whilst this card is not an Artmage card, it's basically engine. With Fusion Deployment, we can reveal Artmage Deactivus to our opponents, because he lists Medius the Pure in his fusion requirements, and then we can summon him from the deck, making Deployment a very good 1-card starter for our combo. Now, something that you could also do is reveal Granganol the Dusk Dragon to summon Cortesia from your deck. This play is really good, but I felt I had to cut it with the recent points increase. A neat play you could do is activate Assault to search Medius, activate Deployment to summon Cortesia from your deck, then you use Assault to make Cortesia into an Artmage monster when you fuse with it, and you normal summon Medius the Pure. Here, if your opponent were to use an Infinite Impermanence or Effect Veiler on Medius, you could chain Cortesia to dodge it. Depending on what's in your hand, you usually made Dusk Dragon, resolve Medius, and send a Garura to draw a card. However, this card now costs you 10 points, so Cortesia basically goes up to 13 from 3. And 13 points just for Fusion Deployment to be slightly better, I don't think is worthwhile. Therefore, I cut the Cortesia from my deck. But the 3 copies of Deployment still remains, being a great starter and extender. And also worst case, it's a spell, so you can pitch it for the field spell if you need to. Then for my non-engine, where most of my points went, 2 copies of Nibiru the Primal Being. Now Nib does depend a lot on the format. If people play control decks, it's not that good. However, for just 5 points, it doesn't cost a lot to play this card in your deck. And the upside of resolving a Nib can be game winning, so I just felt I wanted this card somewhere in my deck. And with my deck being pretty consistent, and the fact that you can shuffle this card back into your deck with Medius the Pure, led me to conclude that it was warranted playing at least for the current moment. This deck is pretty weak to Droll and Lockbird, because you have to search a lot to actually get somewhere. As such, if my opponent does Droll and Lockbird me and I can't stop it, if I have to pass, the non-engine that I would want to have in my hand would be a Nibiru the Primal Being. Because against the OTK combo decks, it's fairly likely I can stop them with the Nib. Not every single combo deck in Genesys format can make a negate for Nibiru. And even if they can, as long as you nib them beforehand, they might not be able to OTK you. And I certainly wouldn't expect them to play around Nib in game 1 either. Perhaps more people will have Nib on their mind now that it does just cost 5 points. But when this card costs 10, pretty much no one plays it in their deck. Whether that's correct or not doesn't really matter. People weren't playing around Nib, which does make the card a lot better. Then I have 3 copies of Ghost Mourner Moonlit Chill. This card is way cheaper than Effect Veiler, just costing you 3 points each, as opposed to Veiler's 7. Now, is Veiler better than Mourner? Probably, because you can do it on normal summons. However, something that Mourner can do is stop Perleys in the draw phase, or against the Radiant Typhoon deck, which is very prevalent. If they go Quick Spell in draw phase, summon Crocea, you can then use Mourner to negate that. Also, if you were to use Mourner as a tuner, the level 3 is actually better than Effect Veiler. Probably won't come up too much, but I do play some synchros for that. Then I have 3 copies of Droll and Lockbird. I still think that Genesys format is so fresh that it's very difficult to say whether this card is good or not. There are so many viable decks and so many decks people can choose from. A lot of people play a lot of different decks, because Genesys has more casual players than advanced TCG. But that does not mean that you can't lose to those decks. So Droll is just a pretty safe pick to have for game 1, if you play against decks that have to search a lot to get their plays going, or combo decks which aim to put up multiple interruptions. The Droll is actually pretty good. Then to negate opposing Drolls, I have 3 copies of Called by the Grave. Now this card does cost 20 points each, which is very steep. However, the effect is absolutely absurd. Called by can be used to stop opposing hand traps like Droll and Lockbird, or Ash Blossom and Joyous Spring. You can also use Called by to negate their monster effects in the graveyard. Say you play against Dracotail and they drew their 1-off 5 mana. Well, you can negate it. Against the Monarch deck I just profiled, you can use Called by the Grave to negate Tessera in the graveyard, which could make them just pass turn outright. Then I have 3 copies of Ultimate Slayer. The extra deck in this deck has plenty of space, so you can readily just play all the targets you want. And I think Slayer is just a really good board breaker in Genesys format. Then I have 3 copies of Cosmic Cyclone. Now main deck in these non-engine spells, which might be a bit situational, at least for Cosmic and Ultimate Slayer, I think is still pretty fine in Genesys format. The format is so slow that you can play some amount of these cards, which maybe don't directly stop their engine. Against a lot of decks, Cosmic can hit something, and Slayer, as long as you go second, or use it on turn 3 if you go first, will usually be better than a 1-for-1 trade. And should you not need these cards for anything, you can just pitch them with the field spell. Your 1.5 card combo with Medius does require any spell and trap to discard with the field spell. As such, if you draw Medius and Slayer going first, The Slayer is just as good as any infinite impermanence or whatever you might have drawn, assuming you need to pitch it for the field spell. So I think playing some amount of slightly high rolling non-engine cards in these board breaker spells is fine for game 1. Then for the extra deck, I have some rank 4s, because I want to make these with Medius. This is not something you make on turn 1, and rarely even make it on turn 3. But the extra deck has quite a lot of space, and I felt these were the best rank 4s, which might come up in certain situations. In that it's a board wipe, spell and trap removal, monster negate, or just generally a very good card in the grind game. Now this list is 99 points. There just wasn't one card I wanted to put in costing me 1 point, which I think is completely fine. I don't think your deck needs to be exactly 100. It's not a waste to play 98 or 99. For example, a rank 4 you could play is Dagusto Emerald, costing you 1 point. However, Emerald is not really good in this deck. At the point where you make a rank 4, with 2 copies of Medius, making Emerald to shuffle back resources doesn't really make sense. It's not like these can be readily made, you usually just make them when you're in a pinch. Because when the power patron is on your field, you're locked into fusions. And fusion employment also locks you, so the way to make a rank 4 is pretty much normal summon a Medius from the graveyard, not use either of their effects, and then you make a rank 4. And for those situations, I think these are just the best ones you could play. But that's it for the rank 4s. Then I have 1 copy of Valon and 1 copy of Aggregator for my Ultimate Slayer targets for XYZs, which is just a monster negate and a back row pop. 1 copy of Malong, 1 copy of Black Rose Dragon, and 1 copy of Packbit. These 2 are Slayer targets, but they can also be made with Ghost Mourner Moonlit Chill. And the Black Rose is just a card you can make in a pinch. With Mourner and Medius, you can make Black Rose just nuke the entire field. And comparing that to any other 7-star, it's probably the best one. Then for the fusions, I have 1 copy of Skull Knight and 1 copy of Garura. Again, these are for Ultimate Slayer. 3 copies of Deactorus, and 1 copy of Nerva. Nerva is the last card in your deck which costs points. This card did go to 5 on the recent list, so I can't justify playing 2 of this, even though I did so in the past. The times that you summon the second Nerva, and actually need to do so to win, are very slim. However, the 3 copies of Deactorus I do think is worthwhile. You often won't summon 3, or even need to win the game. But it could come up, seeing as this deck does play more engine and therefore can grind for longer. And always having access to the Medius shuffle back a Power Patron, and then Power Patron fuse into Deactorus, giving you a 2800 beat stick which is also a walk-in negate. It's still very good. But that's it for the extra deck. Then for the side deck, I have 3 copies of Gamma Seal, the Sea Turtle Kaiju. Just a good out against any random tower decks, such as Lunalight with their Liger Dancer. Then I have 3 copies of DD Crow. Costing you 0 points, it's pretty easy to justify this card in your side deck. There isn't a particular deck which you need DD Crow against, but there certainly are decks in Genesys Format which are playable, which DD Crow is good against. Something like Mermails, for example. Then I have 3 copies of Vados. Excuse the proxy, but I still want Vados in my deck, even though Vanquish Soul likely won't see much play moving forward. At least until they decrease the points on an upcoming list. Vados is really good against the Odeon deck. And even in the Artmage mirror match, unless they have Assault, you can just pop away the field spell. And that effect for 0 points just sounds like a good deal. Then I have 3 copies of Dark Ruler No More, a spell which is good against the board breaker combo decks, and 3 copies of Magic Deflector. Now they did increase Grisaille Prison on the recent list, so I'm not playing that card in this deck, but there's still plenty of decks which Deflector is really good against. So until they make this card cost points, and people keep playing decks like Radiant Typhoon, I'll keep playing this card in my deck. What do you guys think about Artmage in Genesys Format? I don't think the 5 points on Nerva matters at all. And with the support shown in Burst Protocol, which makes Finmill and any spell a starter, I think this deck has a bright future in the format. But let me know what you think in the comments. And until we see each other again, thank you for watching and have a good rest of your day. If you enjoy my content, make sure to also subscribe to my second channel, linked in the description box down below. There I'll be posting more personalized and exclusive content.